What if I told you that the struggles faced by many Black Americans today have roots buried deep in the aftermath of the Emancipation Proclamation? What if we delve into the uncomfortable truth that the famous Declaration of Freedom for Black slaves was, in reality, riddled with political complexities, and Abraham Lincoln's motivations were far more about saving the Union than abolishing slavery itself? The truth is that when President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, it wasn't the instantaneous salvation many hoped for. The proclamation, while historic, only declared freedom for enslaved people in the Confederate States, where the Union held no control. What did it really mean for the millions of Black people still trapped on Southern plantations, still laboring under the cruel sun? Could this paper alone truly break the chains that had bound them for generations? Picture it. A sweltering summer day in the Deep South. The heat clings to the skin, the air thick with humidity. On vast plantations, Black men, women, and children toil relentlessly under the scorching sun. Their hands are raw and calloused from years of picking cotton, their bodies bent and broken from the weight of endless labor. A whip cracks in the distance, a sharp reminder of the overseer's brutal authority. This was the reality of life on the plantation, a monotonous, grueling routine. Dawn to dusk, 6 or 7 days a week, their lives were an endless cycle of suffering. The young ones, too, grew up in these fields, knowing nothing of play or dreams, only the constant rhythm of work. For these slaves, the idea of freedom was as distant as the stars, something they had only heard whispers of, but never dared to truly believe. Then, on that fateful day when the Emancipation Proclamation was announced, something shifted. Whispers spread through the fields, moving like wildfire among the workers. Freedom, could it really be? Was it possible that after centuries of bondage, they could finally be free? The very word seemed fragile, like a dream too good to be true. Older slaves, in particular, were skeptical. They had seen too much pain, too many broken promises to believe that such a monumental change could come so easily. The proclamation had been signed, yes, but what did that mean for them, practically speaking? There were no resources, no land, no aid waiting for them on the other side of freedom. And yet, the weight of history pressed on them, the hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. But the harsh reality was far more complicated. Lincoln's proclamation was not the unequivocal declaration of justice it is often remembered as. In fact, it was a strategic move in the midst of the Civil War, a war that had been dragging on with no end in sight. The famous editor Horace Greeley had publicly pressured Lincoln to take a firm stance on slavery, to end the moral atrocity that lay at the heart of the conflict. Greeley's letter, The Prayer of 20 Millions, was a desperate plea, reflecting the frustrations of millions of Northerners who wanted to see an immediate end to slavery. But Lincoln, ever the shrewd politician, had already drafted the Emancipation Proclamation and was simply waiting for the right moment to act. Lincoln's cautious approach was not because he was a champion of abolition. Quite the opposite. In his response to Greeley, Lincoln made it clear that his primary objective was to save the Union, not to abolish slavery. He famously wrote, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery." This statement revealed Lincoln's true priorities. Slavery, to him, was a secondary issue, something to be negotiated if it helped preserve the Union. In essence, Lincoln's position was one of pragmatism, not moral conviction. If he could save the Union without freeing a single slave, he would. If he had to free some or all slaves to achieve that goal, then he would take that step. For many abolitionists, Lincoln's stance was deeply frustrating. They had hoped for a bold leader who would use the war to strike down the institution of slavery once and for all. Instead, they got a politician who saw emancipation as merely a tool to weaken the Confederacy and strengthen the Union war effort. And so, when Lincoln finally issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862, it was not the sweeping moral victory that many had hoped for. The proclamation only applied to Confederate states, where the Union had no control, and it left slavery intact in the border states that had remained loyal to the Union. Even as the proclamation came into effect on January 1, 1863, the reality for many Black slaves remained grim. Without land, without resources, and without protection, how were these newly freed people supposed to survive? The proclamation did not offer them compensation, it did not give them homes, and it did not provide them with the means to build new lives. In fact, many slaves found themselves in a cruel new reality. While legally free, they had no choice but to remain on the plantations, now working as sharecroppers or laborers under nearly the same conditions as before. Freedom, for them, was an empty word. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation did not magically transform the lives of millions of black people overnight. The systemic oppression that had built up over centuries did not dissolve with a single executive order. Instead, the institution of slavery morphed into new forms of exploitation and discrimination, such as black codes and Jim Crow laws, which continued to oppress black people for generations. The struggles of today, the systemic racism, the economic inequality, the barriers to success, all have roots that stretch back to the so-called freedom offered in 1863. In truth, Lincoln's legacy as the great emancipator is far more complicated than the history books would have us believe. His actions were not driven by a deep moral outrage against slavery, but by political necessity. The Emancipation Proclamation was a wartime measure, designed to destabilize the Confederate economy by depriving it of its labor force. It was, in many ways, a strategic move rather than a humanitarian one. And while it did lay the groundwork for the eventual abolition of slavery with the 13th Amendment, it was far from the triumphant moment of justice that many imagine it to be. As we reflect on this chapter of history, it is crucial to remember the human cost of these decisions. The black men, women, and children who lived and died in bondage were not just statistics or footnotes in history. They were real people, with hopes, dreams, and families. Their freedom was hard-won, and even after emancipation, their fight for equality was far from over. The legacy of slavery continues to shape the lives of black Americans today, a painful reminder that the road to justice is long and often fraught with setbacks. So, when we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation and Lincoln's role in ending slavery, we must be honest about the complexities and contradictions. We must acknowledge that while it was a significant step forward, it was not the end of the struggle. The true fight for freedom, for equality, and for justice has been carried on by generations of black Americans who refused to let their voices be silenced. And that fight continues today. Imagine standing in the hot, suffocating air of a southern plantation in the mid-1800s, where the relentless sun beats down on your back, and the world is filled with the sound of cicadas and the distant crack of a whip. The smell of sweat and soil mixes with the faint scent of cotton fields stretching endlessly into the horizon. You've spent years in the same fields, your hands calloused, your body aching, knowing that your life is not your own. Your family before you lived this way, and for as long as you can remember, freedom was nothing more than a distant hope. The news of emancipation seems like a dream, a cruel tease that might be ripped away at any moment. And that's exactly what it felt like for millions of black people as the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863. President Lincoln's famous declaration is often taught as a sweeping act of liberation, an executive order that instantly granted freedom to all enslaved people in the rebellious Confederate States. But history is rarely so simple. While the proclamation did declare that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are, and henceforward shall be free, the reality was far more complex. The truth, often hidden beneath the layers of glorified history, is that Lincoln's move was more about strategy than morality. He sought to weaken the Confederacy's economic foundation by stripping it of its labor force, but it wasn't a moral crusade against slavery. In fact, Lincoln's primary goal, as he repeatedly stated, was to save the Union, not to destroy or preserve slavery itself. If freeing slaves helped accomplish that, he would do it, but if it didn't, he was more than willing to leave the institution intact. The Emancipation Proclamation was as much a wartime strategy as it was a statement of justice. It only applied to the Confederate States, where Lincoln had little to no control at the time. Slavery remained untouched in the border states that had remained loyal to the Union. Furthermore, in many isolated or rural areas, the proclamation meant nothing. Plantation owners kept their slaves in the dark, hoping to squeeze out one more season of labor, one more crop, before the inevitable collapse of their way of life. Take the case of Charles Hayes, a plantation owner in Kentucky, a state that hadn't seceded and where slavery still thrived under Union protection. Hayes had heard the news of the proclamation, but days passed, and he kept his enslaved workers toiling in the fields, withholding the truth from them. It wasn't until Union forces threatened him with arrest that Hayes, dripping with venomous reluctance, finally gathered the enslaved people and spat the words they had longed to hear. "You're free to go where you please." But what did those words really mean? Booker T. Washington, a man who was born into slavery and later became one of the most prominent black leaders in American history, wrote about the complex emotions that followed the news of emancipation. Yes, there were celebrations. Wild, jubilant celebrations that broke out across plantations, dancing, singing, and tears of joy. But once the initial euphoria faded, a much darker reality set in: fear. What did freedom mean for people who had no land, no money, no education, and no way to survive on their own? Washington described the immense uncertainty that followed emancipation, as newly freed people realized that while the chains had been removed from their bodies, they were still economically shackled. For many, the plantation was the only life they had ever known, and stepping away from it was like stepping into a terrifying unknown. The older generations, in particular, were overwhelmed by the prospect of freedom. Their bodies were worn down from decades of backbreaking labor, and the thought of starting anew seemed impossible. Many made the pragmatic decision to stay on the plantations as paid laborers, not out of loyalty but out of necessity. The system that had enslaved them still held power over their lives, and for many, the transition to freedom was little more than a continuation of their former bondage. Washington's account is just one of many that reveal the harsh reality of post-emancipation life. Thomas Rutling, a young boy at the time, remembered how his family, despite dreaming of freedom, stayed on the plantation for 2 more years after the proclamation was signed. They had nowhere else to go, no resources to build a new life, and the dangers of leaving the relative safety of the plantation were too great. Annie L. Burton, another former slave, recalled a similar story from her Alabama plantation. While the younger, stronger slaves packed up and left as soon as they could, some even joining the Union Army to fight for their newfound freedom, Burton and her sister stayed behind. Their mother had escaped before emancipation, leaving them in the care of their mistress, a woman who, like many others, was determined to keep her labor force intact. The mistress withheld the news of emancipation from the older, weaker slaves, knowing she needed their labor to keep her plantation running. She wasn't going to let them go without a fight, and in some cases, former slave owners tried to manipulate their way into retaining their workforce. Reverend Irving E. Lowry wrote about a plantation owner who, after emancipation, gave a self-righteous speech to his former slaves. He reminded them of how kind he had been, pointing out that he had never separated families or used bloodhounds to hunt down runaways. Then, with a smile that masked his desperation, he encouraged them to sign contracts agreeing to stay on the plantation and help with the next harvest. These contracts were often designed to keep the former slaves economically bound to the land, exchanging one form of bondage for another. The illusion of freedom was present, but the reality of economic dependence remained. The question many people ask is why all slaves didn't immediately leave their plantations the moment they heard the news of their freedom. The answer lies in the systemic oppression that had stripped them of the resources they needed to truly be free. For many, freedom was not a simple matter of walking away, it was a matter of survival. They had no land, no money, no means of transportation, and no way to make a living outside of the plantation system. Even though they were technically free, they were still trapped by the economic and social structures that had been built to keep them in their place. Returning to Africa, as some had hoped, was not an option. The journey was prohibitively expensive, and most had no way of making it. Building a new life in America was equally challenging, as they faced systemic racism, economic hardship, and a society that was hostile to their success. For many, staying on the plantation wasn't a choice, it was the only option. They took whatever wages, food, and shelter they could get and continued working the land because the world outside the plantation wasn't yet ready to let them thrive. The chains of slavery had been broken, but the mechanisms of oppression remained, holding them back from true freedom for generations to come. And then there's the question of Abraham Lincoln himself. Did he know that the Emancipation Proclamation, while groundbreaking, would not immediately lead to the liberation of millions of black people? Did he realize that the social and economic structures of the time would continue to keep them in conditions similar to slavery? Lincoln, ever the politician, had always been pragmatic about slavery. In a famous letter to Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, Lincoln made it clear that his priority was saving the Union, not abolishing slavery. "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it," he wrote. "And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." Lincoln's words reveal the cold, calculated nature of his decision-making. Slavery, for him, was a tool to be used in the larger goal of preserving the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation was a strategic move, designed to weaken the Confederacy and bolster the Union war effort. It was not, as many abolitionists had hoped, a sweeping moral declaration that would bring an end to the institution of slavery in all its forms. Even after the Civil War ended and the 13th Amendment was passed, formally abolishing slavery in the United States, the struggle for true freedom continued. Black Americans faced new forms of oppression, from the rise of the Ku Klux Klan to the implementation of black codes and Jim Crow laws. The economic and social systems that had supported slavery were still in place, and they worked tirelessly to keep black people in a state of second-class citizenship. The legacy of slavery didn't end with emancipation; it evolved, adapting to the new legal and political realities of a post-war America. In many ways, the challenges faced by Black Americans today can be traced back to the incomplete promises of the Emancipation Proclamation. Systemic racism, economic inequality, and social injustice are all rooted in the same structures that kept Black people in bondage for centuries. The road to true freedom has been long and difficult, and the fight for equality continues to this day. What do you think? Did Abraham Lincoln know that Black people would remain in conditions similar to slavery even after they were freed? Should the government have done more to support newly freed people, much like they compensated former slave owners for their losses? Share your thoughts below. And if you'd like us to make more videos exploring these hidden truths of Black history, please support us by subscribing to the Black History Archives and clicking the bell icon to get notified when we post new content.